Dear colleagues, recently one Catholic scholar remarked that there are three most important sacraments in the Catholic Church: the Eucharist, and the Eucharist. This view may be shared by a large number of theologians and non-academics alike, not only in the Catholic Church, but across different Christian denominations, which recognize the importance of this celebration. At the same time, it's worth remembering that in Christianity there is hardly anything as complicated and as controversial as the Eucharist, and hence the topic of this video. Since this short presentation cannot do justice to all the aspects of this complex subject matter, we will pay attention to just a few important features. Today, I will focus more on the historical data. In what follows, I will first briefly refer to the early church, mentioning the formation of different Christian traditions. I will turn then to the period of Reformation and will conclude with a summary of the contemporary critical quest into the Eucharistic origins, which forms a useful foundation for more recent ecumenical dialogue regarding the Eucharist. So our first point, the early church. The earliest Christian writings testify to the importance of the Eucharistic celebration, but also to the problems associated with it. The canonical first epistle to the Corinthians provides such a piece of early evidence. The Apostle Paul, writing in the middle of the first century, speaks of the Lord's Supper. He associates this celebration with the meal Jesus shared with his disciples on the night he was betrayed, and links the bread and the cup with the salvific death of Jesus. At the same time, the passage in question reveals some problems with this celebration. Paul rebukes the Corinthians as follows. "I do not command you," he says, "because when you come together, it is not for the better, but for the worse. For to begin with, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and to some extent I believe it. Indeed, there have to be factions among you, for only so will it become clear who among you are genuine. When you come together, it is not really to eat the Lord's Supper." Similar concerns are raised also by Ignatius of Antioch, Irenaeus of Lyon from the 2nd century, and subsequent authors. The sacred meal, or the Eucharist as it came to be known, appears to have double effect. It, on the one hand, unites the local community, but on the other, it also reveals internal tensions. Despite these problems, we can observe a gradual development of different practices and accompanying theologies in various places during the first millennium. As a result, we can distinguish today between 6 major Christian traditions which developed around prominent centers or locations in antiquity. On this slide, you can see a map of ancient Roman Empire, and we can find the major places around which the different Christian traditions developed. These places include the city of Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, Armenia, Parthian Empire, and the corresponding traditions that developed around these centers are called Latin or Western, Constantinopolitan, Alexandrian, Antiochian or West Syrian, Armenian, and Assyrian or East Syrian. It's easier to remember these traditions by their initial letters as LC and 4As. Each of these traditions developed its own way of worship or liturgy, as well as theology, spirituality, and church law or discipline. Admittedly, this division into 6 different categories does not reflect all the complexity of early Christian traditions, but it may be helpful for didactic purposes as a starting point. It's worth noting that despite this diversity, the understanding of the Eucharist did not appear to be the cause of any division between different churches. In the first millennium, ecclesial conflicts did happen, and churches at some point broke their communion, namely, they stopped sharing the Eucharist. But the latter usually occurred as a result of the split and not as its cause. Interestingly enough, the first properly Eucharistic controversies or debates focusing specifically on the Eucharist appear within individual church traditions. And Reformation disputes can be used as a good illustration of this point. So we come to the second point, the challenge of the Reformation. During the period of Reformation, the Eucharist became a subject of very intense controversy following the centuries of debates between theologians of the Latin or Western tradition. And at the core of the controversy were doctrinal questions, especially the real presence of Christ and the sacrificial nature of the Eucharist. Although these disputes generally had a negative impact, causing division within the Western Church, they also influenced on a more positive side subsequent historical quest for the Eucharist, in that they triggered the publication of collections of liturgical texts. Predominantly Catholic scholars, inspired by the Enlightenment call ad fontes, or returning to the sources, started this publishing activity with the aim of demonstrating that the Roman Mass maintained similar principles of worship as liturgies of Eastern churches not subject to Rome, and that both the Roman and the Eastern Eucharistic rites and teachings can be traced back to the apostolic times. Effectively, this return to the sources led not only to the recovery of a great amount of early Christian liturgical material, but eventually opened the way to the critical historical study of liturgy, which laid the foundation, among other things, for a more ironic approach to this controversial issue. And now we move to the third point, historical study of the Eucharist. And the first subsection of this point is the one source theory. Beginnings of the contemporary historical quest, in a stricter sense of the word, are associated with the development of the historical critical method in the 19th century. Critical approach to the study of the history in general triggered research on the history of liturgy, involving stricter historical and philological methods for establishing the nature of the evidence. At the same time, scholars discussed the origins of the Eucharist, having in mind the doctrinal controversies from the period of the Reformation. Notwithstanding the diversity of approaches and interpretations which reflected particular confessional stance of their proponents, many scholars across the denominational borders used to address the problem of Eucharistic origins with more or less the same set of basic presuppositions. Because the earliest evidence of the Eucharist was and still remains very limited and complicated, liturgical scholars tended to resolve their uncertainties about this early period in the history of the Eucharist by using a model of interpretation co-opted with the help of later testimonies, which were thought to faithfully represent tendencies operating uninterruptedly from the apostolic period onward. Taking as a point of departure the dominical institution of the Eucharist, and informed by the texts from the Eucharistic prayers from the 4th and 5th centuries, which persistently focus on the narrative of institutions, many scholars tended to view the Last Supper both as the institutional moment and as the model of all later Eucharistic celebrations, with several attestations to the Last Supper in the New Testament on the one hand, and comparatively rich liturgical evidence from the 4th century on the other. Scholars were trying to bridge the two by projecting a straight line of development between the Last Supper and the conventional 4th century Eucharists, arranging accordingly the intervening evidence. And hence, the single developmental thread was suggested to lead from the Last Supper of Jesus with his disciples via the Eucharistic celebrations with the full meal in the apostolic and sub-apostolic times, all the way to more elaborate Eucharistic celebrations of the 4th century. Given the formative function attributed to this single event, the Last Supper, this approach was later identified as the one-source theory of the development of the Eucharist. This theory provided scholars with a helpful interpretative frame for the study of scattered and fragmentary primitive evidence on the Eucharist. At the same time, however, it implied an imposition of certain limits on the interpretation. With the exception of just a few scholars, the general tendency in the field of research was to emphasize the similarities rather than to attend to differences in primitive attestations to the Eucharist. And yet, numerous discoveries of new liturgical sources in the second half of the 19th century, primarily the so-called Church Order literature, kindled a new wave in publications of separate materials or collections of liturgical texts, which motivated also further research on the origins of Christian worship. It's worth noting that by the end of the 19th century, even proponents of the one-source theory tended to refine their arguments by recognizing some degree of diversity between early Eucharistic liturgies. The increasing interest in the sources triggered subsequently some more sophisticated discussions on Eucharistic origins. Subsection 2 of this third point is the double source theory. In his important study, Messe und Herrenmahl, Mass and the Lord's Supper, first published in 1926, Hans Litzmann challenged the one-source theory by positing the existence of two types of the Eucharist, right from the apostolic period on. With reference to his study of the evolution of early Christian anaphoras, Litzmann suggests that all the diverse forms of liturgies attested by Eastern and Western textual witnesses of the 4th through 6th centuries can be traced back to two primitive types. Litzmann associates one type with the Hippolyto-Roman tradition preserved in the Eucharistic prayer of the apostolic tradition. He argues that this prayer focuses on the words of institution, shaping the entire celebration into the memorial of Lord's death and resurrection. Litzmann identifies another type of the Eucharist with the primitive Egyptian rite reflected in the anaphora of Serapion of Tmuis. The scholar points out that this prayer, in contrast to the Eucharistic prayer of the apostolic tradition, does not place much weight on the words of institution. He argues that the institution narrative, in fact, is not original but derives from different tradition, and the conjecture which might be endorsed by the lack of the anamnesis there. Litzmann proceeds then to looking for more primitive forms of these two prayers. Tracing further back the Egyptian type, he singles out reference to the breaking of the bread in the apocryphal Acts of the Apostles, in the Pseudo-Clementine homilies, in the Didache, and the canonical Acts. Litzmann points out that all these accounts emphasize two basic ideas. First, the bread breaking at the beginning of the meal, and second, the table fellowship in the atmosphere of eschatological joy, while lacking any reference to Christ's death or the Last Supper. Litzmann suggests that origins of this type of the Eucharist go back to meal practices of the primitive Jewish Christian Jerusalem community, members of which still remembered the table fellowships with Jesus during his ministry. Later on, after the Paschal events, they continued to assemble for communal meals, believing that the risen Lord was present with them at such occasions. Litzmann argues that the second type of the Eucharist may be traced back to 1 Corinthians 11, which describes a community meal focused on the death of Christ and the Last Supper tradition. The scholar conjectures that Paul himself, influenced by contemporary Hellenistic practices of holding some memorial meals for founders of religious communities that all state at the origins of this type of the Eucharist. This Pauline teaching, according to this scholar, molded also the synoptic accounts. In a nutshell, Litzman distinguishes between a Jewish Christian Thanksgiving meal and Gentile Christian sacrificial memorial of the death of Christ as two different types of Eucharists simultaneously existing in the early Church right from the beginning. This double source theory has gained support of several scholars who revised and further developed Litzman's ideas. So we analyzed one source theory, the double source theory, and eventually we will mention the theory of the diversity of Christian traditions. The systematic introduction of most recent developments in the field of early Christian studies into the history of liturgy paved the way for this third position, which emphasizes the diversity of early Eucharists. This view is associated mainly with scholars such as Paul Bradshaw, Andrew McGowan, Alistair Stewart. They criticize both the traditional view of a single line of development of the Eucharist, as well as the double source theory, arguing instead that there was a wider diversity of Eucharistic practices in the primitive church, including the diversity of names of the celebration, the prayers, as well as the overall understanding or theology of the celebration. The emergence of this scholarly consensus is associated with the studies of ancient meals, and especially with works of two other scholars, namely Matthias Kleinhardt and Dennis Smith, who independently of each other traced the origins of the Eucharist back into the common Greek and Roman banquet tradition. They have argued that ancient meals of the Hellenistic and Roman periods, such as everyday meals, symposia, funerary banquets, as well as the earliest forms of the Eucharist, should be considered as belonging to or participating in a common tradition of the banquet. Effectively, these studies opened up a new way of dealing with the question of Eucharistic origins. I would like to conclude this first video by saying that critical historical study of the Eucharist, especially the research into the origins of this celebration, had an impact on the contemporary ecumenical dialogue, which will be the subject of our next video. Thank you for your attention.